layman. I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds like this. But it's of two important events, the local and the national. The local is Howard Berger and the significant progress that has been made in raising the funding for a unique event, the first Judaic chair in the Intermountain West, at one of the small schools in the region, in a state with perhaps the fewest number of Jews, perhaps even in the country. As Marv said earlier, a very improbable event. The national, of course, is the Haven to Home exhibit, which is about 350 years of permanent Jewish settlement in America. My role is really twofold: to bring added recognition to the college and its efforts to endow the chair. And thank you to Ray Nielsen for his first gift, and even double thank you for your second gift from both the foundation and from you and your wife. Let's give them a big hand. The second is my privilege to introduce the traveling exhibit From Haven to Home. The exhibit was created by the American Jewish Historical Society, of which I am currently, quote, just the co-chair. I'm delighted that with us today are so many members, or a few members, I wish there were more, of my immediate and extended families. Unfortunately, my wife Ruth could not be here today. She sorely misses it, but an amazing event. We're having lunch just a week ago, Martin Luther King Day. I didn't go to the office. It was a holiday. And all of a sudden, I realized she doesn't hear what I'm saying. And then she gets up, and she loses her balance. So, long story short, something that is very rare. She's got sudden hearing loss. We hope it'll come back, and in one ear. But the doctors told her that she can't fly for 2 months, so she's not here. Our son Roy is here. Roy, he's a Denverite now. And the other members of the family here are the extended family, the Minnix. Roy's wife, Amy. Amy's mom, Joanne. And Amy's dad, Walt, who many of you know is a former trustee and chair of the Board of Trustees of the college, as well as a U.S. congressman. One-termer, but U.S. congressman. Plus, Adam Minnick, Amy's brother. Adam, where are you? Oh, here you are. Who's, lo and behold, he and Roy went into business together in real estate in Denver, summer of 10. The connections that Ruth and I have with Idaho are limited but important. Roy and Amy met in New York when they were both younger, and they were at Goldman Sachs. They were married in August 1999 in a fabulous wedding ceremony at the base of Baldy Mountain in Sun Valley. The event at the wedding that Ruth and I remember best is when, after the ceremony, oh, by the way, one of the officiants is here, Elizabeth, the Unitarian minister. Elizabeth, where are you? Thank you. And Roy and Amy walked up the aisle, and lo and behold, they just walked directly onto the ski lift. There was an operator there, cranked it up, but before they got on, Roy was handed a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Everyone was stunned. But in a moment, we all gave them a healthy round of applause, hoping they would soon return. Fortunately, they did, and they both were still sober. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, as it's pertinent as to why I'm here. Ruth and I are both lifelong New Yorkers, although, as Marvin already pointed out, Princeton, New Jersey has been a very important part of our lives. My father was the youngest of 8 children, the only one born in America, and the only one to go to college. I was the first in my extended family to attend college during the day, let alone an Ivy League college such as Princeton. 3 years later, my only sibling, my brother Marty, also enrolled, and to our amazement, all 3 of my children and all 2 of his children graduated from Princeton. Our father was the proudest father and grandfather in the world. He would boast, 7 for 7 at Princeton. Amazing. The Princeton tradition in the Lapidus family has now been extended to the 3rd generation, as Eric, our 2nd oldest grandchild, was recently admitted to Princeton, class of 2016. Princeton is particularly important to my story because of the education I received there as an undergraduate major in American history. As we know from the example of Howard Berger, very good professors often have a significant influence on their students. The best example of that, of course, is Ray Nielsen, and we've heard Ray's story. In hindsight, the professor who had the most influence on me, and I didn't know it at the time, was the legendary history professor R.R. Palmer, P-A-L-M-E-R. His much-praised book, The Age of Democratic Revolution, had a great impact on my understanding of the 18th century and the transatlantic nature of the American Revolution. Although I never had any scholarly interest of my own, and over time I decided that instead of researching and writing about history, I would collect it. I collect first editions of the 18th century. As to how I got started as a collector and my principal collecting interest, I'd like to read from an introduction to my first exhibit at Princeton in 1991. Quote, "My first antiquarian book was purchased in London in the summer of 1959. I had just graduated from Princeton as an American history major, and I was absent-mindedly scanning a bookseller's dusty window. I noticed a small book, a 1792 edition of Tom Paine's Rights of Man. The price, less than $5. How could I not buy it? My book collecting career had started. Tom Paine had been my neighbor. While growing up in New Rochelle, New York, I passed his gray, weather-beaten farmhouse almost daily. Curiously, in light of my later interest in his works, I never paid much attention to the Paine presence in New Rochelle. By the way, Paine had a homestead, which was given to him by the state of New York in somewhat of a payment for his services to the state for what he did during the Revolutionary period. He had to beg for it for years, but he finally got it. My interest in collecting took hold slowly, and only in the last decade have I devoted much time and effort to it. Remember, that was written in 1991. Tom Paine was indeed the original focus. Although I did not tend to think about my collection in any systematic way other than to buy what interested me, it became apparent that there was a major theme, the American Revolutionary era from 1760 to 1800. In particular, I focused on American and English pamphlets discussing the relationship between mother country and colony before and during the Revolutionary War. Since that first exhibition in 1999, I began to appreciate that the themes I found so important had to do with the expansion of freedom and the development of rights and liberties for Americans. The latter half of the 18th century was the time when rights gradually became, as Jefferson said, self-evident to many Americans. Paine, in 1791, captured the essence and universal nature of this concept by simply calling it rights of man. In thinking further about rights and liberties, almost 20 years ago, I realized that in my favorite century, the 18th, I had neglected one of the greatest examples of man's inhumanity to man, slavery and the slave trade. Of course, slavery had existed for millennia, but the craving of Europeans for the agricultural products of the New World, especially sugar, led to the horrific transatlantic slave trade and the imposition in the Americas of the barbaric institution of legalized slavery. Finally, beginning in the last quarter of the 18th century, led by Quakers and evangelicals in America and England, the efforts to abolish the slave trade took root and sprouted. My self-assigned mission widened to collect the printed material that led to the ultimate success of the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807 and the U.S. in 1808. There was no more important expansion of liberty than that effort. More recently, I realized that there was a further significant omission in my library, and that goes directly to the expansion of liberty in the 18th century and later, namely the expansion of religious liberty, particularly for Jews in America and Western Europe. I began collecting books and pamphlets relating to the expansion of civil rights for Jews, as well as books by and about Jews and their secular accomplishments, starting with the readmission into England in 1656. This interest in Judaica led me to become quite active in the American Jewish Historical Society in New York. The peak of my collecting career has been a 7-month exhibition of highlights from my collection at Princeton's Firestone Library in 2009. The exhibit, which took several years to prepare, was created in honor of the 50th anniversary of my graduation. Princeton's rare book curator and I selected about 160 items from my collection, which we called Liberty and the American Revolution, selections from the collection of Sid Lapidus. This is not all I have. I still have about 2,500 at home. Accompanying the exhibit was a catalog, which included a foreword by me entitled Reflections Upon 50 Years of Book Collecting. This included 2 sections, What and Why I Collect and Life as a Collector. Some portions of what I'm speaking about today are excerpts from the catalog. To my surprise, the catalog won an award that I didn't even know existed. Best Catalog of the Year from the American Library Association. In part, the motivation behind my exhibit and catalog was to make more readily available to students of American history the founding texts that make us who we are today. This morning, I had the privilege of sitting in on Howard Berger's lecture about the historiography of the American Civil War, and Howard was emphasizing the importance of primary documents. I collect primary documents. I was so pleased that several months ago, Princeton, at its expense, completed digitizing all 32,000 pages of the books in my exhibit and posted them on its website. Moreover, in cooperation with Princeton, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, a New York organization, whose principal mission is making the secondary school teachers of American history into better teachers, has already created 3 modules of 2 or 3 pamphlets each from my collection and posted them on its website. I suspect that the number of hits from this site, oriented toward more advanced high school courses in American history, will far exceed the hits from Princeton's site. Either way, the more hits, the better. That all might be interesting, you may say to yourself. What's that got to do with the College of Idaho? In the summer of 2010, as Marv said, I read a news article about Howard Berger and the beginning of a campaign to endow a chair at Judaic Studies here at the college. I was so taken with the concept, Jewish studies, Idaho, that I emailed Howard and asked to see him if he ever came to New York so that I could learn more about the program. Besides getting a lovely email from Howard, the next week I got an email from President Marvin Henberg asking if I could meet with him and Michael van der Velden, Vice President of College Relations, as coincidentally they were going to be in New York the following week. Before going forward, I did some research, reference checks. So I called Walt Minnick. Walt, is this for real? He says, coincidentally, I am a former trustee. I used to chair the board of trustees. It is a wonderful school. I then called Joanne Minnick. She says, it's for real. I have taken courses at Osher, which is the adult learning program in Boise, and Howard is fabulous. On the basis of these laudatory comments, I hosted a lunch for Marvin and Michael, and I even sent money for the campaign. A few weeks later, Marv asked me if I'd be interested in exhibiting parts of my collection of early American Judaica. I responded that it wouldn't quite work, primarily because much of my collection of American Judaica has already been donated to either Princeton or the American Jewish Historical Society. However, I said, I got something better. That was to help arrange for the college to exhibit Haven to Home, 350 Years of American History. The 350th anniversary of the first permanent settlement of Jews in America was an important time for the American Jewish Historical Society, an organization founded in 1892, only a year after the founding of the College of Idaho. We, the AJHS, were a leader in commemorating the 250th and 350th and 300th anniversaries of Jewish settlement in America, as we again were a leader in commemorating the 350th. Historians tell us that there were mixed emotions among American Jews at the 250th and 300th anniversaries. The 1905 celebration took place in the shadow of heightened anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment, as so many Jews and other immigrants from Eastern Europe were coming to America. In 1955, American Jewry was still recovering from the impact of the Holocaust. Fortunately, the 350th was celebrated in better times for American Jews. In 2005, at a celebratory dinner in Washington, D.C., President George W. Bush honored our 350th anniversary both by his presence and by speaking about the American Jewish contribution to America and the significance of religious pluralism. President Bush said, "The story of the Jewish people in America is the story of America itself." However, what I remember most vividly about the president's speech was that in thanking a list of people who had helped organize the event, he mispronounced my name, saying Lapidus instead of Lapidus. I was sorely tempted to jump up and correct him. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a bevy of Secret Service agents. I stayed where I was and let it pass. So I'm correcting the record now. In 2003, the AJHS in New York and the American Jewish Archives in Cleveland, which is an arm of the Reform movement, committed to lead the celebration of the 350th. Recognizing that the celebration could reach a truly national and diverse audience if other non-Jewish historical organizations were involved, our two Jewish initiating organizations secured the cooperation of the two great national repositories of our American heritage, the Library of Congress and the National Archives. The centerpiece of the celebration was the development of an exhibition based upon the long Jewish experience in America, based upon the holdings of all four partners. To much acclaim, the exhibit opened at the Library of Congress in 2005. It then traveled to two other venues, following which the objects in the exhibition were returned to the institutions from which they were borrowed, many of which came from the American Jewish Historical Society. Subsequently, we in New York, at the AJHS, and our partner institutions at the Center for Jewish History, and 5 of us live together at 15 West 16th Street in New York, and you all are invited to come. We chose to launch our own exhibition in 2005 based primarily on our own joint holdings. The then AJHS president, a Bostonian, determined that it was a disservice to allow these exhibitions to just be dismantled. We received permission from the Library of Congress to make a facsimile version of the original exhibit, which then had its first display for several months at the U.S. Courthouse in Boston. That traveling exhibition is now on exhibit here in the authorized facsimile version, which has already been exhibited in about 10 cities, including LA, Detroit, Las Vegas, and Denver. To curate an exhibit of 350 years of American Jewish history is not an easy task. A former executive director of the AJHS, Michael Feldberg, offered a brief summary of American Jewish history. "23 Jews landed in New Amsterdam in 1654. Peter Stuyvesant tried to expel them. They won the right to stay. Now 3 of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court are Jewish. We have survived and prospered. Let's eat." Of course, the story is far more complex and richer than that. And by the way, much of my remaining comments about 3 centuries of American Jewish history are excerpts from Michael Feldberg's talks at various openings of this exhibit. At a dinner in New York at the 300th anniversary, President Dwight Eisenhower delivered a stirring address in which he called the arrival of Jews in New Amsterdam, quote, "an event meaningful not only to the Jews of America, but to all Americans of all faiths, of all national origins." Then Izzy Balin, a Russian Jewish immigrant who long before 1954 had changed his name to Irving Berlin, sang his patriotic hymn, "God Bless America." Berlin, of course, was one of the greatest song composers in American history. Noted in particular for such non-Jewish holiday classics, not for Happy Passover, but for White Christmas and the Easter Parade. In "God Bless America," Berlin put into words the deep gratitude that he felt towards the United States, which had been to him and to countless new Americans like him, first a haven and then a home, hence the name of our exhibit, From Haven to Home. From the time of its discovery, America has been a haven for men like Izzy Balin. In 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World, Spain expelled its Jews, and 5 years later, Portugal did the same. The remnants of Iberian Jewry found refuge throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, and in 1630, some of their descendants found a haven in the then Dutch colony of Recife in northeastern Brazil. 24 years later, in 1654, Portugal captured Brazil and expelled its Dutch settlers. The machinery of the hated Inquisition followed the Portuguese troops, and Jews were forced to leave Recife. Most of them returned to Holland or to Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. But a small group of 23 Jewish refugees, 3 men, 7 women, 13 children, wound up in New Amsterdam, now New York. Shortly after the group landed, Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of the colony, wrote to his employer, the Dutch West India Company, asking permission to expel them. Stuyvesant called the Jews, quote, deceitful and repugnant, whose presence would, quote, infect and trouble this new colony. He went further. He warned that by granting the Jews residency, quote, we cannot refuse the Lutherans and Papists. The Jews appealed to the West India Company in Amsterdam, and the company's investors, some of whom, by the way, were Jewish, allowed them to stay, albeit with the condition that the Jews had to become financially self-sufficient and not a burden on the community. An important precedent was set then. American Jewry would care for its own rather than expect public charity. Today, American Jews have become perhaps the most charitable of all American ethnic or religious groups, donating their time and money not only to Jewish organizations, but also to so many pillars of American communities, such as hospitals and cultural organizations. The principles of tolerance and diversity of religions, however reluctantly given to the Jews in New Amsterdam, remained in place after the English conquest of the colony as it became New York. These principles then spread to all of the colonies that formed the United States. The promise of America was deeply rooted in the new nation's commitment to religious liberty after it gained independence from Britain. As you will see in the exhibit, George Washington's declaration in 1790 to the Newport, Rhode Island Hebrew congregation that this nation gives, quote, to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, close quote, provided the Jews of America with assurance of America's continuing suitability as a haven with the promise of being a true home. More about this a little later. In the period from 1820 through 1924, an increasingly steady flow of Jews made their way to America. From the 1840s through the 1870s, Jewish immigrants came mostly from German-speaking Central Europe. In addition to settling on the East Coast, Jews gradually made their way to dozens of small towns and cities across the United States, including Boise. At the turn of the 20th century, Boise had a 2-term Jewish mayor, Moses Alexander, who later became governor of Idaho from 1915 to 1919. Just a few weeks ago, while doing some research about the early history of Jews in Idaho, I came upon a book entitled History of the Jews in Utah and Idaho, written by Juanita Brooks, published in Salt Lake City in 1973. This is a book with 15 chapters, 14 about the Jews in Utah. That one chapter about the Jews in Idaho has a wonderful anecdote about Mose, M-O-S-E, Alexander. Apparently he was called Moses. When in 1914 he was running as the Democratic candidate for governor. My wife implored me to emphasize that I do not intend to make any political points from this anecdote. This is strictly a nonpartisan anecdote. I quote from the book. Most would stop and address people wherever they gathered, and not far from Caldwell. Yes, Caldwell. He came upon a cluster of farmers. Inviting himself to address them on the issues of the day, he spied a low shed nearby and offered to speak from the top of it. But most, one of his entourage protested, they store manure under that shed. That's no place to speak. Most mounted the shed, looked out over his impromptu audience and observed, "This is the first time in my life I've ever spoken from a Republican platform." I didn't make it up. It's in the book. Maybe she made it up, but I didn't make it up. I guess campaign politics in Idaho and elsewhere in America has changed a little over 100 years. Between 1881 and 1924, the principal source of Jewish migration to the U.S. shifted from Germany to the east. As many as 2 million Polish and Russian Jews fled their native lands due to religious and cultural persecution and the lack of economic opportunity. And that's true for my grandparents, and I suspect many of your grandparents. The majority of those sought haven in America's cities where they clustered in neighborhoods close to downtowns, joined the working class, and built strong networks of religious, cultural, spiritual, voluntary, and social organizations. This period of immigration ended with the passage of restrictive laws in the early 1920s, which limited American Jewry's efforts to rescue our European brethren in the 1930s and 40s. In effect, the doors were mostly closed to Jewish immigration by the mid-1920s, and not to open again until the 1960s. Despite the religious liberty that Washington promised and the passage of the Bill of Rights with its guarantee of religious freedom, there has never been a time when prejudice and discrimination did not pose a challenge to American Jews. Thankfully, over time, American Jewry's increasingly well-organized and firm response to acts of intolerance and supported by a majority of Americans prevented the persecution of Jews from sinking deep roots in the U.S. It does seem to me that how a nation treats its Jewish population is the best indicator of its attitude toward toleration of its other minority religious groups. Confronting the challenges presented by anti-Semitic attitudes and private behaviors in America began with those first 23 settlers in 1654. Over the next 3.5 centuries, this has led to the founding of communal organizations focused specifically on responding to prejudice and preventing it through education and legal action. One of the key principal national organizations is the American Jewish Committee, and I'm proud that my wife is a member of the Board of Governors of the AJC. Fighting discrimination and exclusion has been one kind of challenge. Dealing with the realities of acceptance and assimilation is the other side of that coin. Since their arrival in America, Jews as a group have faced the challenge of maintaining their religious and ethnic identity in a secular and open society. In America today, Jews often define themselves as both separate and equal. But the sense of solidarity amongst American Jews does not at all mean that American Jews is unified religiously, politically, or any other way. Rabbinic efforts in the 19th century to unify American Jews around a common sense of religious rituals failed. There would be no single form of American Judaism, much as American Protestants have resisted a consensus version of Christianity. The nature of American society, with its acceptance of religious diversity, provided America's Jews with an unprecedented sense of security and safety. The degree of feeling at home in America has varied from immigrant wave to immigrant wave, and even from person to person. By 1950, the majority of American Jews were born here. After World War II, Jews became a vital force in the political process, advocating on behalf of oppressed co-religionists abroad and for civil rights for Jews, African Americans, and other minorities at home. Nothing has made American Jewry more proud of their heritage than the founding of the State of Israel. And we are so proud of our country, the United States of America. Since President Harry Truman recognized the State of Israel in 1948, and in the exhibit on one of the panels, there's a big holograph version of Truman's edited letter with his markups. Every presidential administration has steadfastly supported Israel. As a matter of fact, politicians today compete to who can be more of a friend to the State of Israel. Who would have thought it? Even before Irving Berlin, Jews have played a significant role in the cultural, intellectual, and political life of our nation. Over generations, there has been a gradual shift as to how American Jews perceived America. America has gone from being merely a safe haven and has really become a true home. Despite the occasional rise of religious fervor among certain far-right Christian groups, including those here in Idaho, the status of Judaism as an integral and equal religion in America is no longer open to question. Equally important, the status of Jews as full and equal Americans is settled. Our exhibition reminds us that in early eras that are sometimes painful to remember, Jews faced laws barring them from building synagogues, required them to acknowledge the divinity of Christ before taking public office, and excluded them from serving as military chaplains. This exhibition also recalls the social arrangements that excluded Jews from education and employment opportunities and membership in private associations. My adult children and yours can hardly imagine some of the social and employment anti-Semitic experiences that I and my contemporaries and many of your parents and grandparents and mine went through. I would like to relate two of my own personal experiences. In the social area, as a Jew at Princeton in the 1950s, I was unable to get into the eating club, the Princeton equivalent of a fraternity. I was unable to get into the club of my choice. Only a generation later, the discrimination barriers had fallen, and two of my children joined that club. Subsequently, Princeton, like most of the other Ivy League colleges and many of the colleges around the country, has had a Jewish president, my friend Harold Shapiro. In the employment area, in the 1960s, when I was leaving my first job as a lawyer for the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York, I was being interviewed for a position at the prestigious old line investment banking firm, Morgan Stanley. For a while, I thought the interview was going fine. However, the staid, buttoned-up partner at his roll-top desk with whom I was interviewing gradually had the thought dawn on him, Sid might be Jewish. Horrors. Would it be proper to have a Jewish professional in the hallowed halls of Morgan Stanley? He began asking me a series of questions, which today are probably illegal. And if they aren't, they should be. For example, he had the gall, or to use the Yiddish word that has become part of American English, he had the chutzpah to ask me to translate the Hebrew words on the Yale seal on his side chair. I guess in hindsight, looking back, I was a wimp. I didn't tell him what he could do with his chair. That was a different era. Of course, I didn't get the job. Good thing, too. After all these years, I'm still amazed as I ponder how pervasive and pernicious these anti-Semitic screening efforts really were. Today, we are fortunate that there's almost no job or profession in America where we Jews are presently excluded. However, our Haven to Home exhibit is less about the barriers that American Jews have faced and far more about the ways that Jews have confronted and lowered these barriers, not only for themselves, but with and for American ethnic and religious groups. In that sense, the 350-year sojourn of American Jewry is a quintessentially American story, rather than simply a Jewish one. With the wonderful support from our friends here at the College of Idaho, my new friends, the AJHS proudly brings this version of From Haven to Home to this community where visitors of all backgrounds and faith will view it. We believe that the story of American Jews can and should inspire every American and would-be American. The exhibition documents the evolution of a persecuted and excluded minority into a well-accepted, productive, and acculturated part of the mainstream, even as it retains its distinctive religious and ethnic identities. The story of American Jewry is one that other groups have replicated in the past or are in the process of replicating in the present and will doubtless do so in the future. For all of these groups, as for American Jews, as for America's Jews, the journey from Haven to Home is not only always easy, but the destination is worth the effort. Before closing, I would like to present a book to the library of the College of Idaho, which I think is appropriate for this occasion. Marvin, would you please join me? I apologize, I found the glasses. The book, which I recently bought, is a disbound copy of one of the earliest magazines in America. It is the June 1791 issue of what was called, quote, American Museum or Universal Magazine. That's 1791. Buried at the end of Appendix 2 in the magazine is one of the earliest printings of the historic letter sent in August 1790 by Moses Seixas, leader of the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, to President George Washington, who had been inaugurated as our first president in April the year earlier. At a time when there were only about 1,500 Jews living in the U.S., think about 1,500 Jews living in Idaho, in a handful of Eastern Seaboard city, the letter seeks assurance of religious freedom for Jews. Its key sentence is, quote, deprived as we heretofore have been, this is Moses Seixas wrote this, deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generally affords to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of that great governmental machine. President Washington, in his historic response to the Jews of Newport, repeated verbatim the now iconic words of Seixas, to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. I guess that makes Seixas the first of the many Jewish speechwriters for an American president. I'll get this out of here. Okay. wife did this too tight. Don't tell her I said it. Okay, here we go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.